Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching Avenging Varus Part 5, Battle of the Angrivarian Wall by Invicta. Last time we saw a major Roman victory over the Germanic tribes, but Arminius is not yet down for the count. Will he be able to come back with a stunning victory of his own, or will the Romans push their advantage further? We'll have to see. Now, before we get into this one, I would appreciate it if you guys would check out my Patreon. It is linked down below, and it will give you access to exclusive and regular reaction content. Anyway, with all of that out of the way, let's jump right into this video.
7 long years after the deadly, humiliating disaster of the Teutoburg Forest, the Romans had finally gotten the fight they were looking for. A straight-up, face-to-face match on a fair field before fair gods.
Yep.
In this bloody contest, both sides had traded heavy blows.
And you know, we talked about this for a while, frankly, throughout this entire series, about how in a face-to-face pitched battle, the Romans had a serious advantage. This is what they were trained for, this is what they were ready for. And if we look at all of the major Germanic victories, or times when these German tribes even came close to a victory, usually it was because they managed to pull some sort of trick on the Romans. They managed to pull, say, some sort of ambush. I mean, that's what the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest was. And so this sort of pitched battle was not playing to the strength of Arminius and the German tribes, but was absolutely playing to the strength of the Romans.
But it was the Germanic tribes which ultimately took the fall. Yet even still, they were not knocked out and would not tap out.
Not yet.
As the Romans cheered, the coalition of Arminius summoned the last of their strength for one final stand. This would be the climax of the Germanic Wars.
Yeah.
When the sun had set over the battlefield of Idistaviso, the beasts of the forest had a feast that would last them months. The fields, forests, and rivers were strewn with thousands of dead. While the crows picked at the eyes of once proud warriors, the Romans desecrated the fallen, erecting a massive monument to their victory, adorned with the arms of the defeated, and placards calling out the names of the vanquished tribes.
Yep.
By any stretch of the imagination, they had finished this fight. However,
And yet, somehow, these Germanic tribes are continuing. I gotta say, that is pretty impressive. As they said, at this point, the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest was years in the past. Frankly, the aftermath of that battle has been over for a while. We're at a completely new phase of this conflict. And during this phase, we have the campaigns of Tiberius and now Germanicus. The Romans have basically been dominating. Now, sure, there were a couple of points, say the Battle of the Long Bridges, where the Germanic tribes had the advantage or came close to a victory, but overall, the Romans have absolutely been crushing their Germanic opponents, and yet Arminius keeps going. Pretty impressive.
the Germanic people somehow managed to drag themselves out from the pits of despair. It appears that the very arrogance of the legions served to only harden their hearts, with the grotesque monstrosity they had erected deep within Germanic territory acting as a lightning rod for the enemy's defiant fury.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the Germanic tribes know what their other option is. Their other option is to bow to Rome and go the way that many other peoples have gone before, go the way of the Gauls, now loyal subjects of the Roman Empire. And, judging all of the brutality that's been committed against them by the Romans, you can see how, of course, they don't want to do that. They're just becoming angrier and angrier. But, I mean, with most struggles, it does reach a certain point where you can resist no longer. And even though the Germans are becoming more determined to resist, they are losing manpower. I'm sure they're losing supplies. There's only so far they can go, and we'll have to see if they reach that limit or if they can continue the resistance against Rome.
Thus, the allied tribes reconvened a war council. Though fewer in number than weeks before, their cries for war were just as loud. For Arminius, the plan was simple: abandoned the futility of the open field pitched battles, and returned to the terrain which had yielded them advantage in the past.
Right.
Marshy, hilled forests.
And to be fair, Arminius has basically been saying this the whole time. We think back on the Battle of the Long Bridges, Arminius had the Romans in such a vulnerable position, yet he didn't want to just rush in and go for it. He wanted to bide his time, lure them into a trap. That's not what ended up happening, because the other Germanic leaders didn't want to listen to him. But, Arminius has been saying this for a while now. That initial victory at the Teutoburg Forest, led by Arminius, was because they managed to trap and ambush the Romans. So, we know this to be true, and I agree, if the Germans want to have another major victory, they need to pull away from these pitched battles.
With renewed purpose, the Germans retreated north along the Weser River, regrouping as they went, until they found a place that was appropriate to their needs. It was near a strategic ford in the river, which they knew the enemy would likely have to cross if they wished to continue further campaigning in the region. The exact location was specifically chosen at a point where the local road wound its way through tricky terrain. Tacitus describes it as follows, quote, "At last they fixed on a position pent in between a stream and the forests, with a narrow waterlogged plain in the center. The forests too were encircled by a deep swamp, except on one side where the Angrivarian had raised a broad earthen barrier to mark the boundary between themselves and the Carusi." There is some contention from historians about whether or not this Angrivarian wall was a pre-existing fortification, given the dubious utility of its short span in comparison to the shared 50-kilometer border between the tribes. Yet perhaps it had seen some limited use over the years owing to its strategic position. Either way though, it appears that now Arminius would have ordered it to be fortified. The Angrivari must have been more than happy to lend their labor in this regard.
Alright, here we have the center, the locus of our next battle, the Angrivarian Wall, as it is called. Arminius, sort of taking a Roman approach to this whole thing, backing up, regrouping, and getting to building. How Roman of him. Not necessarily building a camp, but building a wall. That's also a very Roman thing to do. The Romans love building, whether it be bridges, walls, camps, that sort of thing.
As it was their lands which had been greeted with fire and blood at the beginning of the year, and which now stood threatened. As the walls went up, their Germanic battle plan became clear. Force the Romans to come to them across the bog and palisade, hold the flanks using the terrain, and once the moment is right, unleash an ambush on committed troops, rounding them with nowhere to go.
Alright, not necessarily as sneaky as some of the other German plans, but still essentially a plan from Arminius that relies on pulling the Romans in, bringing them in, and then springing some sort of surprise on them, jumping them, ambushing them, using, soldiers held in reserve. Basically a similar pattern that we've seen work before. Arminius wants to repeat that.
Unfortunately, such schemes were quite evident to the Roman scouts who had shadowed the Germanic force.
Right.
These exploratores kept close tabs on the construction works and the numbers of the tribes which were amassing. This was all communicated back to Germanicus. The commander...
maybe the Romans are also starting to get wise to these German tactics. They're like, okay, so you want to draw us in, then ambush us using hidden troops from the sides. Yeah, we've seen it all before. We're ready for it. Or maybe not. I don't know. I mean, the Romans at the same time could be very haughty. They could often refuse to learn from their mistakes if they felt they were too good for it. But, like I said, at the same time, the Romans were also good at learning from other cultures, adopting new ways of doing things, and so you sort of have this interesting thing where the Romans certainly could learn from their mistakes and grow if they wanted to.
Had at his disposal more cavalry than the enemy, and could have easily chosen to steer clear of the obvious choke point, raiding the enemy rear lines until they were forced to abandon the position.
Right.
However, he smelled blood in the water and saw the concentration of enemy forces as a unique opportunity to end things once and for all.
Wow, okay.
No marsh or wall could stop the Roman juggernaut, no matter the casualties incurred.
Okay, that is an interesting and I would say fairly risky strategy. So Germanicus sees the trap that is being set and he says, you know what? I don't need to engage with this. I could go around, I could take you down from behind, but I'm going to go straight for you because this is also an opportunity for me to take you down. Now, you could say that could be some of that Roman overconfidence I mentioned. Maybe these Romans are getting too big for their boots. They think, well, you couldn't possibly beat us. Or maybe Germanicus is tactfully taking advantage of this situation and knowingly, moving towards what the Germans are setting as a trap, but, he knows that it's not going to work. I guess we'll see. I mean, look, Germanicus has been doing a pretty damn good job so far, so I have some faith in the guy.
This was the way. Germanic scouts soon reported that the Romans were coming. Arminius and his men quickly finished the last of their works and braced themselves for the impending fight. The bulk of these forces were likely arrayed across the width of the wall, with substantial numbers of cavalry, light troops, and reserve warbands occupying the heights on the eastern flank. The Romans, meanwhile, approached in 4 main groups. The first consisted of 4 legions under the command of Seius Tubero. These would be the bull that charged straight at the wall in a full-on frontal assault meant to occupy the enemy.
All right.
The second, composed of the Praetorian cohorts and commanded by Germanicus himself, would advance at their side, seeking out another breaching point once fighting was underway. The third included all of the Roman slingers, archers, bolt throwers, stone throwers, and catapults, and was meant to provide close fire support. The last group consisted of the 4 remaining legions and the cavalry, which were to be held in reserve. The battlefield, after all, was extremely restricted, and these men were no use clogging up the center.
All right, so the Germans under Arminius have set a trap. The Romans have knowingly walked into it. From their perspective, the Romans are basically trying to force another pitched battle. We just had this pitched battle that was an extreme success for the Romans. Now Germanicus is trying to do the same thing. He says, I see your trap, and you know what? I'm going to go straight through it. We're going to have another face-to-face pitched battle, which you are going to lose. And like I said, of course it could go either way. I don't think that the Germans are completely done for, they have no hope. But with all the success the Romans have been seeing, and the competence and leadership of Germanicus, I'll put it this way, I'm kind of worried for these Germanic tribes at the moment.
Instead, they would serve as a fresh wave to be committed as necessary for the attack, or to cover a retreat. Battle must have begun with the twang of the Roman artillery teams firing at extreme range. Under the best conditions, this could reach targets at some 500 meters. The first volleys likely fell far from their mark, giving the Germans some comfort in their defenses and perhaps inviting the bravest among them to clamber atop the barricades to jeer at the enemy. However, the following barrages would have quickly been calibrated, crunching into the woodworks and perhaps impaling the most exposed of the defenders.
Yeah, don't get too cocky.
Josephus would later write of the sickening impact such projectiles could have on the human body, reportedly sending heads and limbs flying across the battlefield.
I'm sure. I mean, not to linger on it too much, it's pretty grisly, but you imagine that sort of projectile, thudding into the wooden fortifications. Imagine it thudding through someone's shoulder, mostly dislodging their arm from its socket. That's some pretty nasty stuff. That's why I say, don't get too cocky. Hey, get yourself off of the damn wall.
Next came the 4 legions of the assault force. Those of the left advanced through the worst of the marshy ground, breaking up and slowing their formation, while those on the right advanced more quickly. As these both approached the earthworks, trumpets were sounded for the charge. However, they were met by an eruption of shouts from the battlements and a torrent of projectiles which had been stockpiled for the occasion. These barrages and the high ground blows of the defenders wreaked havoc on the lines. Here and there, brave centurions with knots of soldiers broke through, but by and large, they struggled to crest the fortifications. Germanicus apparently realized the dangers of pressing on and ordered the legions to pull back momentarily.
Okay. I wonder what exactly Germanicus is planning to do, because, I probably would not have chosen this strategy of just go straight forward. It's a very Roman thing to do, just keep marching forward, overwhelm the enemy, even though they have fortifications set up. It seems like at this point, Germanicus might be like, yeah, maybe not. So I guess we'll see if he'll just recharge back in with, higher intensity, or if he's going to try and work something else out. I mean, he's got a lot of troops held in reserve, not to mention the Praetorian Guard under his personal leadership, so he has a lot of options available to him.
He was seemingly able to do so from such a committed position speaks volumes of the discipline of the Roman army.
Yeah.
Now, with a bit of breathing room, the ranged units can be brought even closer and safely fire upon the enemy. Tacitus states, quote, "Spears were hurled from the engines, and the more conspicuous were the defenders of the position, the more the wounds with which they were driven from it."
Is crazy because, this activity from the Romans is what you would expect to see from the defending force, hiding behind their lines, chucking projectiles, and yet this is what the Romans are doing. The Germans have their fortified wall, but the Romans, well, they've got their shield wall. That's their fortifications at the moment. And they've got their ranged troops, firing arrows and slinging projectiles over at the Germans, seemingly at a much higher rate than the Germans are throwing projectiles back.
Thus suppressed, the outnumbered and outgunned defenders could do little more than hunker in place. This now allowed the Roman infantry to recommence their assault up the center, while Germanicus led the Praetorians up the right flank.
There you
These
go.
elites quickly overwhelmed the fortifications in that sector before plunging into the wooded heights in an attempt to root out and envelop the enemy. All across the front, the battle raged fiercely as the tribes committed everything they had to holding the line. Not an inch of blood-soaked ground would be given without a fight. For the Romans, the stubborn resolve of the defenders sorely disappointed those who had expected a swift repeat of Idista Viso.
Yeah.
By comparison, this was a battle that would see the Romans plunged into the meat grinder.
Alright, so I would say, even though the Romans are moving forward inch by inch, it looks like they are probably going to take the victory at the end of this battle. The Germans are putting up more of a fight than they expected, so I would say that maybe Germanicus got a little overconfident. Now, not too overconfident. You see the advantage he has. He still has a lot of troops in reserve. This whole trap set by Arminius hasn't really worked at all. It has turned into another pitched battle, but the Germans are putting up a stronger fight, tougher resistance than they did last time.
Germanicus himself was even forced to commit to the fighting in the front lines to shore up the morale of the assault. Arminius, meanwhile, still wounded from the prior battle, was unable to get as close to the action, but nonetheless urged on the defenders. Tacitus describes the situation, saying that both sides in that place had hope only in their bravery, salvation only in victory. Yet as morning turned to afternoon and the sun began to set, the Germanic tribes still stood strong. This was deeply troubling to the Roman commander.
Yeah.
It would be impossible to fight at night, and if the enemy still held the fortifications, then they would be in a perfect position to sally out and destroy the legions, who might very well panic should victory continue to elude them.
Interesting.
He therefore sent an urgent message back to the legions in the rear for them to begin the construction of a camp.
Very interesting. So, as I said, Germanicus basically immediately overwhelmed Arminius' plan to sort of draw the Romans in and then surprise them, attack him from the side. That plan was immediately overwhelmed. But because the Germanic tribes are putting up such a strong fight, Germanicus is not moving forward as fast as he predicted. He's not absolutely bowling over these Germanic troops. They are holding their ground. They are holding these fortifications. And so now both sides are in a bit of a tricky situation.
Was this really happening? Was Germanicus truly about to be bled out into a draw? Would the rest of Germania rise up in the aftermath? Would they wipe out the entirety of the Roman presence east of the Rhine? Would this be a Teutoburg 2.0?
Okay, I mean, no. All of that, I'm sure those are some of the fears going through the minds of the Romans at the moment, but no, of course, that is extremely over-exaggerated. Now, at this point, you could imagine a situation where, this battle falls into a stalemate and the Romans are forced to pull back, or maybe even sort of a technical loss, but I find it hard to believe that this would become an absolute disaster for the Romans, especially not on the scale of the Teutoburg Forest. Now, at this point, like I said, you could imagine it not going super smoothly for the Romans, but with all the success they've seen so far, no. I don't really think there's a possibility that this would end up being incredibly disastrous for the Romans. Underwhelming? Sure, maybe. Even bad? Maybe so, but disastrous? I doubt it.
These dark thoughts began to infiltrate the minds of the Romans. Finally, however, as a result of some unrecorded incident, a crack finally formed in the Germanic dam. All at once it broke, the legions now bursting through the exhausted lines of the defenders as an unstoppable tide. All before it were swept aside, and the last of the Germanic tribes now fled en masse.
There you go. And that battle did not really come down to sneaky planning or ambushes or whatever. It came down to the Romans throwing themselves at the Germanic line, the Germans resisting as much as they could, and eventually the Romans managing to push through. Once again, sort of this face-to-face pitched battle, line against line. Some pretty simple stuff, but some stuff that, of course, takes intense training, bravery, and determination.
Some pursuit was given by the cavalry, but this reportedly yielded little result. The bulk of the Roman army was in no state to follow and pulled back to their new camp. The next day, these claimed dominion over the battlefield, collecting their dead while despoiling those of the enemy. Once again, Germanicus used these spoils to erect another massive trophy.
Goodness.
This one was adorned with the following inscription, quote, "The army of Tiberius Caesar."
I will say this is a real campaign of terror. I mean, like I said, the Romans loved to build. They loved to build monuments and buildings and all that sort of stuff. Here, in this campaign, we have seen now, of course, along with the brutality that Rome has been inflicting on Germania, burning down towns, massacring people, selling people into slavery, they're also fairly frequently erecting basically monuments to their own brutality. Now, of course, from the Roman perspective, these are more monuments to their own victory, but let's be honest, the purpose of these is absolutely to, sure, celebrate Roman victory, but to instill terror in the local populations, terror amongst the Germans. I mean, that is what is being done here.
Caesar, after thoroughly conquering the nations between the Rhine and the Elbe, has dedicated this monument to Mars, Jupiter, and Augustus. Eager to keep up the pressure, Germanicus next sent Tertinius with a picked force to crush the nearby tribe of the Angrivari for the second time this year.
Oh no.
However, on this occasion, the tribesmen showed none of their usual resistance. They knelt immediately, and, as Tacitus smugly comments, quote, "As suppliants, by refusing nothing, they obtained a full pardon." It's
Yeah, that typical Roman smugness that we love to see. So typical. And, this is sort of the point that, and I think we're going to get to this, this could be seen as a bit of a tipping point, where you could either go one way or the other. What we're starting to see here is, this Germanic resistance is basically starting to fail. Now, Arminius is still alive. He still has men under his control, but his movement is getting weaker. We now see tribes like the Angrivari, surrendering. Other tribes have been completely crushed by Rome. This is starting to remind me of a certain point in, the Roman campaigns in Gaul. I mean, done by good old Julius Caesar, where you get to a point where resistance starts to taper off and tribes start to surrender. And there is still a lot of resistance to come in the future. There's rebellions, there's uprisings, there's coalitions, but you're reaching a point where Rome can truly begin to establish permanent domination over the territory. That seems to be what we're moving towards here. Now, as we know, in the long term, that isn't what happens, but from this perspective, like I said, I really do think it looks like Rome is approaching this sort of tipping point where they are moving towards becoming the hegemon of the region.
It seems that likewise all tribes west of the Weser quickly followed suit, while many to its east began similar talks.
Right, yeah.
Arminius, however,
I mean, this is typical stuff. This is how you know Rome is truly gaining control of a region. You know, they start defeating the resistance movement. It starts to maybe not crumble, but weaken significantly. And you have large numbers of influential or powerful tribes beginning to surrender or ally with the Romans.
and several key chiefs of the resistance fled beyond the clutches of Rome rather than submit.
Right.
Yet with all this, by now the strain of Rome's logistics was becoming increasingly noticeable. Much of the army was therefore marched back to the Ems to rejoin the fleet. Huge numbers of troops and supplies were boarded and began to sail downstream, while those who could not fit followed closely along the banks. This must have been a journey of extremely high spirits. Unfortunately, however, once
not
the ships
again.
made their way across the North Sea, disaster befell them.
Dude, Germanicus does not have good luck with the weather, man. Whenever these Roman legions step in boats and try to sail back into their own territory, they get hit with a disastrous storm.
Once again, another massive storm crashed upon the fleet. Those not dashed upon the shores were cast in all directions, some reportedly being washed as far away as the shores of Britain, while
Jesus!
others were stranded
What?
on distant islands where they starved to death.
God.
Tacitus
Hey, maybe a sign from the gods, I don't know.
records that Germanicus held himself responsible for this awful ruin and would have killed himself in the sea had his comrades not restrained him.
That seems a little overblown. I mean, you know, I did say you have bad luck with the weather, my man, but that ain't your fault. Though, if I was a Roman, I might be thinking, you think the gods are angry with us? Do they not want us to conquer Germania? What's going on here? I mean, this is the second time we have been hit with a horrific storm on our way back. What are they trying to say here?
Rumors of the fleet and army being destroyed spread like wildfire across Germania.
Oh,
Somehow,
man.
once again, the lands were tempted by the hope of victory.
Unlucky
This was not
for
something
Rome.
the Romans could allow.
Unlucky.
Germanicus now moved quickly. Tacitus recounts the following. Quote, he ordered Caius Silius with 30,000 infantry and 3,000 cavalry to march against the Catti. He himself, with a larger army, invaded the Marsi, whose leader, Malovendus, who had lately admitted to surrender, pointed out a neighboring wood where he said an eagle of one of Varus's legions was buried and guarded only by a small force.
Oh.
Immediately, troops were dispatched to draw the enemy from this position by appearing in his front, others to hem in his rear and open the ground. Fortune favored both. So Germanicus, with increased energy, advanced into the country, laying it waste and utterly ruining a foe who dared not encounter him, and who was instantly defeated wherever he resisted, and, as we learnt from prisoners, was never more panic-stricken than now. The Romans, they declared, were invincible, rising superior to all calamities, for having thrown away a fleet, having lost their arms, after strewing the shores with the carcasses of horses and of men. They had rushed to the attack with the same courage, with equal spirit, and seemingly with augmented numbers.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, Germanicus is quite unlucky with the weather, and I think a lesser general, you know, this could have been a big blow to his plans of conquest. You know, it could have shown his weakness, but Germanicus and these Romans under Germanicus basically took this as an opportunity to show the Germans, we're not going away. This isn't going to stop us. Don't you even try and rebel. They rushed in there, strong as usual, reclaimed apparently another Eagle standard, and showed the Germans that, yeah, we're here to stay and nothing can stop us. And truly, it must have seemed like the Romans were close to invincible at this point, with all of their victories, surviving these catastrophic weather events, and yet, you know, every time they come right back, do some more conquering, and prove that they are no pushovers. Like I said, I think if you knew not what was to come, and you were just looking at this right now, you would not be mistaken for thinking, this looks like the build-up to permanent Roman occupation. It really looks like that.
The soldiers were then led back into winter quarters, rejoicing in their hearts at having been compensated for their disasters at sea by a successful expedition. They were helped, too, by Caesar's bounty, which made good whatever losses anyone declared he had suffered. It was also regarded as a certainty that the enemy were wavering and consulting on negotiations for peace, and that, with an additional campaign next summer, the war might finally be ended.
They're ready to keep going.
Unfortunately for Germanicus, this was not to be his destiny.
Yes.
While he had been gallivanting...
Now remember, I'm going to preface this with, we all must remember that we've been so focused on the military side of things, but Rome is a big, big empire. There are many different interests, many different interest groups, and a lot of politics going on that, we haven't been looking at as we hyper-focus on Germanicus's campaigns. The world hasn't stopped turning while Germanicus has been fighting against these Germanic tribes. Oh no, other events have been occurring, and, defeat in the field isn't the only thing that can bring your campaigns to a stop.
Through the forests, his adopted father Tiberius had read incoming reports with increasing alarm. The emperor himself had been one of Rome's preeminent generals, with a personal connection.
I'm sure we remember from earlier in this series, how did we begin? Before the campaigns of Germanicus, who was sent? Tiberius. We saw the campaigns of Tiberius himself, though he was recalled because, Augustus was on the verge of death, and Tiberius was next in line. But, we started all this with Tiberius. Now Germanicus is in that position. This talented, competent young fellow who is looking like a pretty promising heir, and has been, on these successful campaigns. They've sort of, Germanicus is in the position that Tiberius once was.
Connection to the soldiers. After all, he had made a name for himself leading careful, logistical campaigns that minimized losses. In contrast, the campaigns of Germanicus were aggressively bloody affairs that left a trail of dead from both sides in their wake.
Yes, and despite their similarities, Germanicus and Tiberius are, I think, quite different. Both were very respected, but Germanicus is more sort of the people's hero, a soldier's soldier. This hero of the people who would charge into battle regardless of the death count and would win these magnificent victories. Whereas Tiberius, he was not this sort of people's hero. He was logistical, he was cautious, he was quite strict on his men. I would say he was more respected than he was loved, I'll put it that way. He took things slowly, cautiously, didn't want to participate in these massive battles with these high death tolls. So, despite the similarities these two men share, I think in terms of personality, temperament, and style, quite different.
What was even more egregious to Tiberius was that on many occasions, such as at the Angrivarian Wall, these losses could have easily been mitigated with just a pinch of caution. Would Germanicus be willing to sacrifice yet more legions in service of his own victories? This could...
And, I think Tiberius has a point here, right? Now, Germanicus is the fan favorite, right? And you can see why. He's this sort of glamorous hero. And I absolutely get that. I mean, he's clearly a talented guy. Also, Tiberius is not the most popular Roman emperor. He has a lot of flaws. He's disliked by a lot of people, actually. But, consider what he's saying. We talked about when Germanicus was planning to attack the wall. We said, okay, he didn't have to do that. He decided to. Did he need to? I don't know. Also, once again, there's a whole empire. Tiberius, he can't just be hyper-focused on this one region. He has to be focused on the rest of his territory. He has other lands to worry about, other enemies, other problems. He needs troops and resources elsewhere. He can't just be focused on this one war. This one war that, is quickly escalating in terms of the death toll and the resources required. So, I'm not trying to say that, Tiberius is 100% right, or trying to side with one over the other. I'm just saying I do think Tiberius has a point here.
Not be allowed to stand. An angry and perhaps jealous Tiberius thus chose to recall Germanicus.
Yeah, and I think that's a part of it too. We can't ignore that. You can probably already tell this from the way I've framed it, but, Germanicus always had more popularity than Tiberius did. Tiberius, I think, especially further into his reign, was not necessarily the most popular emperor. I mean, he certainly didn't fill the shoes of Augustus, the first and probably greatest Roman emperor of all time. Tiberius, he just wasn't that kind of guy. In comparison, Germanicus was very popular. He was young and dynamic, popular. People loved him, so there's probably jealousy there. And also, Tiberius was a pretty paranoid guy. He's probably also a little bit paranoid about Germanicus. Even if maybe Germanicus would take his position in the long term, maybe that's fine, but what if Germanicus revolts, or what if he tries to take the emperorship now, or, whatever. So I imagine, along with those legitimate concerns, there was also jealousy and some fear tied up.
From the front. The field commander, meanwhile, argued that despite the Roman military having been bogged down in Germania for decades at this point, all he needed was just one more year. Just one more, and Germania would kneel to Rome. Tiberius, however, responded in his letter that...
And this is sort of the idea that survived among many people. You see many fans of history, fans of Roman history, even today will say, if Germanicus had just had one more year, if he just could have continued a little bit longer, he could have conquered Germania for years to come. Obviously, we don't know, because it didn't happen. I think there are some flaws with that line of thinking. Some of you have even commented that, there were other issues about Rome ruling over Germania, aside from what we've seen here. It wasn't necessarily feasible in the long term, but regardless, a lot of people still think that, Germanicus, if he just had one more year, just more time, he could have done it.
Quote, enough of this success, enough disaster. The battles have been huge and favorable for Germanicus, but he should not forget those grievous and shocking losses by wind and waves. I myself, when I was sent into Germany 9 times by the divine Augustus, achieved more through diplomacy than through strength alone. Thus the Sugambri were brought into submission. Thus the Suebi and their king Maroboduus were forced into peace.
I think you could definitely see some of the jealousy here. Enough of this success. Tiberius saying, well, when I was in Germany, I actually did a lot with diplomacy. I mean, you could try that a little bit, Germanicus, could you? There's definitely jealousy interlaced throughout this letter, frankly.
With regards to the Carusi and the other rebellious people, since Rome has taken her vengeance, let them be abandoned to their own internal squabbling. This letter would prove to be a pivotal moment in the history...
And, I mean, ultimately, that is what will happen, right? If you think about it, supposedly, the point of this whole campaign was Roman revenge. Supposedly, it wasn't to conquer Germania. Now, if you ask me, I think, Tiberius, through diplomacy and careful conquest, he was prepping the ground for Roman conquest of the area. I think that's what Germanicus has also been angling towards, but Tiberius is sort of bringing it back to the original claim, the original goal. He's saying, look, we've achieved our vengeance, leave the Germanic tribes to squabble amongst each other. We need not waste resources on them. That's basically the point he's making.
Of Roman-German relations. As we shall see in our final episode to follow, it would have a huge impact on the ultimate fate of Germania, of Germanicus, and of Arminius.
Yes. Alrighty. Great episode. I'm real excited for this last episode. We've been talking about sort of the future of Rome's relationship with Germania, and as they said, they're going to sum it up in the last episode of this series, so I'm excited to see that. We also get to see what happened to our main characters, Germanicus, Arminius, all these sorts of people. I think that'll be interesting. Yeah, this was a really good episode. We saw, another great Roman victory, and then we got to the politics, you know? And I feel like I've said what I wanted to say about sort of the merits of what Tiberius was saying, but also the fact that there's a lot of things tangled up in his request for Germanius to return home. Also, you know, like I said, a lot of people still love Germanicus today. A lot of people do think that if he had just had more time, he could have done what he needed to do. And more than that, though, you know, even some fans of Germanicus who don't argue that do wonder what would have happened had Germanicus lived longer. But that is a question for next time. I don't want to get into that, because that's what we'll be covering in the next reaction. This was a great one. Next episode will be our last one. I've had a good time with this series. I'm excited to bring it to a close. If you guys enjoyed this one, please leave a like, subscribe, and check out the Patreon. It is linked down below, and it will give you access to exclusive reaction content. Anyway, with all of that out of the way, I hope you guys are having a good day today, and I will see you all again next time. Goodbye.